I'd like to begin with you, David, sort of on the broad context of President Biden's visit. One of the things that sort of stuck out to me was sort of the genuine warmth between the president and the Israelis and Israeli leaders. At the beginning, when he sort of stepped off of Air Force One, there seemed to be a genuine warmth. Maybe it's how it always is, and we're just not used to it with COVID. We have to retrain ourselves to think of warmth, but there was a genuine warmth. It's just something that struck out to me. So just in the broad context of this visit, David, what was sort of, in your mind, the state of the U.S.-Israel relations? What were Biden's goals on this trip? And do you think they were achieved during his visit to Israel and to Saudi Arabia?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm joining you from a hotel room in San Francisco, where I am this week. And Orna is, I think, 10 time zones over. So it's good to be with the JCRC of DC, my hometown. Look, as you pointed out correctly, the warmth was part of the message. You know, he gets off a plane. He says, you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. This is at a time that Zionism is under assault. I mean, there's these two big trends going on with Israel, which is the normalization with Israel, which is coming out of the Arab world, and there's the delegitimization of Israel and a delegitimization of Zionism, frankly. And here he is saying, I'm a Zionist. That in itself, I think, was very powerful. Going to Yad Vashem, kneeling next to two Holocaust survivors, tearing up. This is a Biden who comes out of the 20th century. It's epic events, born during World War II. The birth of Israel. He talks about how they talked about the young state at his family table. He's, the wars. This is the 67, 73. He's lived through the Soviet Jewry movement. He's lived through really the epic developments that span the life of Israel. So I think his visceral connection, that's what Israelis like, which is a Kishka politician, someone who wears that love of Israel on its sleeve. I think it's not just a personal thing. I think it's something that Israel is able to translate it into the region to its friends and its foes that don't underestimate the vibrancy of the U.S.-Israel relationship. I think I was watching some of the Israeli commentary. There were some who were almost mourning it, saying, this is, there'll never be someone like this again who has that visceral connection in the Democratic Party. I think a lot of it is up to Israel, too, and how it maintains U.S.-Israel relations. But that historic link, there's no Israeli that could say, as I told Golda Meir, and, internalize that famous story that he loves to tell so much. When she says, what is Israel's secret weapon? And she says, we have nowhere else to go. And he really internalizes that story, that the world owes the Jewish people a state. And so I think with Biden, you can be the most hardened cynic, but I think with him, it's genuine. So that's on the personal piece. On the policy side of the visit, as I see it, there were a couple of noteworthy points. On Iran, some of the formulations were like we heard in the Obama administration, all elements of American power was used. But in that interview with Yonit Levy on Channel 12, which is Israel's leading television channel, she said, would you use force if needed? And he said, as a last resort, yes. I don't think it has been stated so directly in the past. Whether it's going to shift the nuclear negotiations and the impasse between the U.S. and Israel there, I'm a bit skeptical. But I think it was certainly a different music, I would say. On the Palestinian issue, it was clear that this issue was rather relegated to the margins. In fact, in that same Yonit Levy Channel 12 interview that was taped at the White House the day before he left, or the day that he left, and played on the first day of his visit on primetime TV in Israel, he used a formulation that is really an inversion of the Arab Peace Initiative, where the Arab Peace Initiative was front load the Palestinian issue, and then we'll get to the region. And here he's saying, I give you the direct quote, but first Israel has to be accepted into the region and respected. And then down the road, there could be some accommodation with the Palestinian issue. It is a historic, almost decoupling or inversion of these two questions. And even when he was in Bethlehem, he kind of said that two-state solution. He used the borders based on 67 lines with land exchanges, but he said not now. This was the most direct that we've heard. Now, some of us have felt, this has been U.S. policy for a while, but here he kind of codified it with his trip. I think the main point, though, I want to get, and then I don't want to talk too long and turn it back over to you, is that this idea of regional integration, I think this was kind of his real kind of sense of being marinated, if you want to call it, into the Abraham Accords. Clearly for him, he got this arrangement where Israeli planes can overfly Saudi airspace in return for these islands that were under the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, but now Egypt has transferred them to Saudi, and the peacekeepers can leave. There's some other methods, I think cameras to keep up just in case, but I think, this was something that he made the first step in Saudi-Israel relations. Might be some charter flights for Arab Israeli Muslims who want to go on a Hajj to Mecca. And I think, but he didn't announce that part. But I think this was part of it for him. And the fact that, I saw that line he used in Saudi Arabia, that the Middle East is an opportunity and not just as a threat. That all his life, going back to the wars we talked about, I didn't even mention the Iran-Iraq war, the US war in Iraq, the Afghanistan war, if you want a little further afield. The Middle East has always been about a battlefield. And he's saying now it's about economic opportunity as well. Now, the Iran issue looms very large, but I hope we'll have a chance to flesh this out over the course of our talk. I really think this idea of regional integration, which Israel sees more in security terms, but also in economic terms, the Arab Sea in terms of the economics, I think is about a shifting region where it's not a dictate from the US like it used to be, like you must integrate. No, it's coming from within the region, and that's based on self-interest. And if it's based on self-interest, it's more sustainable. So I think this is his real immersion into this whole regional dimension, a good news story for this president. And we'll talk about the oil, I'm sure, and other things and what he wants from the Arabs. But I think for Israel, could be very pleased overall, but both by the public demeanor of the trip and by some of these policy dimensions that, even though none of them in and of itself was transformative, I think overall add to a good direction and a win certainly for the US-Israel relationship to be able to project to the region and beyond a vibrancy that was very vivid and visual.
Great. Thank you, David. You said a Kishka politician? Was that the term you used?
Yeah, Kishka politician, the Yiddish, visceral, from your gut.
Yeah, love it. I love it. If we learned nothing else today, that's a term we can take with us. A Kishka politician. Love it.
Yeah.
It's perfectly described. So thank you, David, for that overview. Orna, I just want to pass over to you. David sort of talked about a little bit on the American side, just on the Israeli side. What were Israel's goals for this trip? And I imagine most of the people on the call know that Israel is currently in an election cycle. I mean, when is it not? But and the current Prime Minister Lapid took office only a couple of weeks ago. So what was Israel trying to get out of this trip, of President Biden's trip, and were they successful in doing so?
Okay, thank you for having me, and good day for everybody. In Israel, it's evening, so I don't know. Anyway, about the goals of the Israeli side, I must say that there were not so high expectations, and the main goal, because of the complex political situation in Israel, the main goal was that it will pass with no incidents, that it will be a nice and good, friendly visit. And I think that in this, the Israelis achieved what they wanted. And if you look after a week, what was happening here, we can say that it was a very important. Every visit of American president is important in Israel. And it's not like, I looked at the American media, they weren't talking about that so much. But in Israel, it was a big event. Everybody talked about it. All the channels were dealing with it for a few days, and it was important, and I think quite successful. Though not all Israel's goals were achieved, especially not on the regional aspects. So on the personal level, David said it was a very friendly visit. The president was excited and very enthusiastic, and it was a visit of a friend between friends, and this was nice, very nice atmosphere. And especially when it comes, when we are dealing with a Democratic Party president. And for Israelis, it was one thing to mention that maybe we are not going to have such a friendly president in the future if it's going to come from the Democratic Party. So this is for the personal level. About the bilateral relations, I think that on this matter, there are the main achievements from the point of view of the Israelis. And what stood out was especially the partnership between the states and the American commitment to Israel, to the QME, to supporting Israel's right to defend itself. It was pronounced in the Jerusalem Declaration, very important. The two leaders were signing on that. And if you read carefully the declaration, you can find two important issues on the bilateral level that are great achievements for Israel's security. The first one was the $1 billion additional aid for defense purposes, for the laser project and other issues. And if we add it to the 3.8 of the MAU, it will sum up with something like $5 billion that Israel is going to get from the US annually in the next few years. So it's important. It's important for the security projects that Israel is dealing with on defense. Another important issue that I think not a lot of people paid attention to it is the fact that there was signed a new high-level technological cooperation agreement that was is about cooperation on strategic level, having a dialogue on technology in the fields of cyber defense, AI, quantum, etc., technological issues. But I think that this has also, from the American side, this has also political implications because regarding the Israel's relations with China, because US is not so much happy, to say the least, from the improvement of Israel-China relations in the past few years. And I think that in this agreement, it's not written, but this agreement can limit this cooperation on technology between Israel and China. And again, US is becoming our main partner on this issue. So this is for the achievements on the bilateral level. Now, about the regional aspects, I think there were not very high, but some expectations in Israel that there will be improvement in two issues. The one was the normalization, and the second one, the most important for Israel and the top on the security agenda is, of course, Iran, on the nuclear issues. So on these two issues, I think there is not so much progress, and regarding the normalization, of course, there is this announcement of the Saudis about opening the airspace for all flights, including Israeli flights. But I think that in Israel, the expectations were higher. They expected something more than that, and we didn't got it. I don't know if it was realistic, but this was the expectation, that we are going to have more than that. And what we heard was that the Saudis are still committed the two-state solution issues in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and this is the condition for any normalization of the Saudis with Israel. So there is no change on this. And I think that in Israel there was expectation to have more than that. Another issue that we didn't, there wasn't any progress on it was the expectation in Israel of having some regional understanding about cooperation on missile defense against Iran. And even in Israel, there were some that were talking about mutual regional protection system that will come out from this Gender Security and Development Summit, but nothing on that. We are still very far of it. We see that the Gulf states are afraid of Iran and are afraid from the possibility that Iran will have nuclear weapons, but prefer to maintain good relations with Iran. And we see some of them engaging with Iran lately, and leave Israel alone to deal with the threat posed by the Iranians, especially on the nuclear issue. So there is no change on that, and this is quite disappointing here. And to add on this is about, of course, the Iranian issue. That's for the Israelis is the most important, and there is no change on the American policy about that. The only achievement was that Biden explicitly said that the United States will not allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons, but it is just a statement, and the question is how he's going to do that, how and when, and there was no change in two main issues. The first one was the fact that Biden still preferred the diplomatic track, that in Israel lost the hope that it is going to achieve anything. In Israel, most of the politicians, of course, and some in the security establishment think that it's a bad agreement and won't prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapon, and that Iran will take advantage of lifting of the sanctions, and will continue with negative activities in the region. So there is still a dispute about this issue, and in Israel there is no acceptance of the diplomatic track as the solution. And the second difference is, of course, regarding the military option. In Israel, David, you have mentioned what the president was saying to Yonit Levy in the interview, but in Israelis' eyes, it's not enough. It's not enough. It's not what was expected. The Israelis expected clearer US commitment in this matter, and it didn't come. And anyway, in Israel, and the chief of staff is talking about it this week a few times, was talking about it, about that Israel is going to start preparing itself for this option. And of course, Israel is waiting to have some cooperation with the Americans on that. And the question is how and when it's going to happen. About the Palestinian issue, there was no change. So for this government, that is government that doesn't know what they're doing with the Palestinian issue, it was good because the president did not challenge Israel on this issue. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't promise anything to Abu Mazen. Just repeated on the two-state solution issue and gave some financial assistance to UNRWA and the hospital in East Jerusalem, and that's all. So from the Israeli point of view, it's okay, nothing happened. We can continue with what we are doing, and there is no change on that also. I think I will stop now and leave the rest for the questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. That was a great overview. I really appreciate it. And just a reminder, if you do have questions, please submit them on the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. Thank you both for those great answers. There's a lot there that we could spend hours and days and weeks discussing, but a couple things sort of stuck out. One thing you mentioned, Orna, was about the low expectations in Israel and about the issues Israelis, with Democratic Party and Biden coming and that sort of thing. In one of the interviews, as I recall, he was asked directly about that. He said, many in your party are saying Israel's an apartheid state. What do you think of that? And Biden was very clear, saying, I think they're wrong, and that's a minority of the party. So I guess I have both your takes on that. It seems to me nothing is sort of done by accident. Nothing is said by accident, although with Biden, his long history of saying things that he maybe shouldn't say, you never know with him, but it's assumed that wasn't an accident. Studying, David, on your side, how do you think Biden sort of speaking out, saying, I believe it in my core, and people in my party who say otherwise are wrong. How do you think that plays? And then on the Israeli side, how do those kind of comments go over with the Israelis? So starting with you, David, if you don't mind.
Thank you. I think you're right to pick up on this, and I would link the Jerusalem Declaration to those remarks too, because in a certain way, it was kind of almost a Biden manifesto of Biden Democrats towards Israel. Very, talked about against BDS, along with a whole other set of issues, including universalistic principles, a historical connection to Israel. It mentions Tikkun Olam and universalist principles, and goes policy point by point about the security commitments and the BDS. I think he's trying to say here, the progressive wing of the party is not going to define the U.S.-Israel relationship. There is a Biden school of thought here. And to the extent Israel has an interest in that Biden school prevailing against, some of its progressive competitors, I think they clearly saw the manifesto in that way. It didn't maybe break a lot of new ground on the policy issues, but I think that, it definitely was done with an eye towards the American domestic debate within the Democratic Party. And Biden saying, I'm not going to let these rivals of mine, define this relationship. So I think you're right to pick up on it. Could I respond to Orna on one point, or maybe I'll wait on the regional defense piece, where I think she and I see it a little bit differently, but I'm happy to wait.
Yeah, that was actually my next question about that. So
I'll wait.
Flip on that. Yeah, go ahead on that. How did those comments, and David mentioned the Jerusalem Declaration and those sort of things, how does that go over in Israel? You're muted.
People in Israel were very much concerned about the fact that during the Netanyahu and the Trump presidency, Israel got the image of being not bipartisan. And I think that this visit is building again the image of Israel as bipartisan issue, and this is why it's positive from the Israeli point of view. And I think that it was important on this issue. And the big question is if Biden is going to be the president just for 2 years or 6 years, and who is the one that is going to come after him. But I think that it's a kind of a good change. A positive change for the Israeli-US relations.
Great, I do appreciate that. All right, David, you mentioned you had a comment on the regional security, and this on that sort of on the broader regional integration, as you mentioned in your opening remarks. You talk about opportunities. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So I want to make 2 points, and here I think I guess it's not interesting enough if Orna and I always agree on things, but I think we might disagree on the issue of on the regional missile defense. Look, there's the question of what's the reality and what are the optics? How is it publicly discussed? And it's clear that what's really almost, I don't like to use the word revolutionary, but it's somewhat of an earthquake, is the fact that Israelis and Arabs and Pakistanis, I should add, are sitting together in Tampa, Florida, under this place called CENTCOM, the Central Command of the US military. And according to all reports, they are sharing intelligence. They are talking about cyber. They are talking about the joint radar, dealing with drone and other missile attacks. And they are doing all the things that Israel really could not do when Israel was under the European command, which was for almost all of its existence. But now at the time of the Abraham Accords, for the last 2 years, Israelis and the Arabs are planning together. And Israeli military people are visiting these countries. These relationships are being built. It's beautiful. And it's, but because, you don't see the videos of it because it's behind closed doors, you question whether it's happening. But it's happening. I think what happened, in my view, and maybe this is, you mentioned the domestic piece of this, is the Israeli domestic elections, is that suddenly the defense minister Gantz started talking publicly, who has his own party. We want to talk about this new structure on regional defense, but it's going on at CENTCOM. But the Arabs don't like it being discussed publicly because, as the Emirati said to me when I was in Abu Dhabi, it goes, easy for Israel to talk. Israel's 1,000 kilometers away. They're a stronger military than we are. We're on Iran's doorstep. Israel hits Iran. Iran hits Israel's best friend in the Arab world, which is now the Emirates. That's us, So they don't like it public that way. And indeed, if you look, comb the communique, all this talk about regional integration, there's no mention of Israel and a regional missile defense or anything like that. And I knew that going in, that Biden was not going to publicly do it, but the Israeli media, I felt on this one, hyped it. And I think because it was an election season by the defense minister who started talking about this publicly. But the fact is what's going on in CENTCOM is extraordinary. For people who've been following the U.S. relationship for over 70 years, that level of cooperation is just deepened dramatically between Israel and Arabs. And I think this is something to be celebrated and not a point of consternation. Another element where I think is interesting is this whole question of, is the Abraham Accords regionally a bypass road or a bridge? The Palestinians are convinced it's a bypass road, but it could be a bridge. And the Emirates are funding these projects in Jordan, these massive solar farms, because they have a huge desert in Jordan that is going to provide electricity to Israel and Iraq and all these countries. And Israel is providing, desalinated water, because Israel has all this desal. And it's a case of where the new normalizers are creating political space for the old normalizers. That was unimaginable. But now what's happening, during the visit, it came out that Morocco is now going to help the Palestinians on, I think, refurbishments at the Allenby Bridge and things like that. So it's, the more you find the cases, I think, of the Arab states actually using their new relationship with Israel to be of assistance to either Israel or the Palestinians, I think it's a great thing. And now you've got Kochavi, the chief of staff, who in return is going to be going to Morocco this week. Might already be there today. So I think there are a lot of regional pieces that are happening. They're not always trumpeted like a shofar, but that doesn't make them less significant. The fact is, there's a lot of shifts in a very positive direction.
Well, I would like to comment on that and to say that it's a way of perspective. If you look at the half empty or half full water in the glass. So I think that in Israel, the expectations were that it will be more than what it is now. And I don't want to elaborate. And it's more talks and not actions. And it's for sure, it's new, it's great. We have relations, we visit, they are coming. But if you look at what is happening, and if there is a real, and CENTCOM is great. The fact that Israel now it's in CENTCOM and there is this cooperation with the Americans through CENTCOMs and the other partners. But I think that when we are talking at the Iranian threat, we would like, and now I'm presenting the Israeli point of view. We would like them to be more cooperative with the needs to the defense needs, and do more than the talks. And the fact that they are engaging Iran is and not accepting doing more than on the ground is for us quite disappointing.
Right. I mean, Orna and I agree.
The half full or the half empty.
Look, the beauty of Zionism, as someone said to me on the difference between the half full and the half empty, is the Zionists have always believed of adding new water to the glass. And that is the idea of a Jewish state on acting for self-interest on the international stage. So I think I think what was it? Golda Meir said, if you're not an optimist, Israel cannot afford the luxury of pessimism. And Ben Gurion said, that if you don't believe in miracles, you're not a realist. But of course, we have to look at these things realistically. And Orna and I do agree on this point that the Iran issue did not really, I mean, there was this comment, which is a public statement by the president saying yes in last resort. But I don't think Orna or I, if I'm right, Orna, I don't want to speak for you. I don't think that anyone thought that the visit would break the impasse on the nuclear negotiations. I mean, right now, the ball is in Iran's court. They are having crazy demands, in my view, that they want to be delisted from the terrorism list for the Revolutionary Guards. The United States is not going to agree to that. And you would look, I don't know if we're going to get down this thing because this might take us in a different direction, but I do think there, according to reports, and I think more than just reports, that there are some differences within the Israeli establishment over the advisability of whether maybe it's better to have an agreement, at least for 7 years, to get the uranium out of the country, out of Iran, and to make sure they're not close to a bomb this way. We could have that discussion. I don't want to take it away from the moderator, but I don't think any of us expected a transformative moment in the Iran nuclear negotiations. At least I certainly did not. And I think it's stuck. I mean, what Israel's trying to say is, okay, it's stuck, but where's the plan B? If it doesn't, I'm stuck. And here it's missing. Israel would say, listen, we should enlarge these talks. We should talk about JCPOA 2.0 that would bring new issues to the table, which is snap inspections, ballistic missiles, maybe even some of the malign regional activities of Iran. But and maybe Bennett kind of hinted at what he called more for more, which Macron famously, the president of France, used, which is to say, he says, more should be no sunsets ever, but willing to lift the sanctions. The U.S. is not going there. And I think the U.S. is saying it's hard enough to do the book. You want me to do the movie? It's hard enough. So the U.S. doesn't put forward a plan B and no list of new sanctions. It's waiting for the Iranian response. So Orna and I do agree that there's been no major shift.
I agree with that, and I said there were not so high expectation on that issue during the visit, and I agree with you that it's not just having a plan B. It's talking about what we are going to do the day on the new era after we understand that we don't have any agreement, and we can't go on with thinking that we are negotiating. There is no negotiations. We are not going anywhere. And most of the specialists in Israel predict that is not going to be any good result from this negotiation. So in Israel, we think that we have to go onward and forward and talk about what's going on, what's going to be next, and not be stuck with the negotiations.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. And please, everyone on the webinar, please continue to put your Q&A in the box. every time a new one comes up, they actually answer it. Our great speakers answer it or touch on the topic before I even get to ask it. So that's great. You guys are all feeling it together. I wanted to ask about Russia's influence in the region and China's influence. So how did all that play into the visit? I think we had a question about Russia in the Q&A. If you start with you, Orna, if you don't mind. How does Russia and China's influence, how did that play into the visit?
I think that it was one of the issues that has been discussed, because there is some kind of tension between what the US wants from Israel that has relations with China and Russia, and what was Israel's position towards the Ukraine war. So there is some tension, and I suppose that they talked about it, but I think the US understand that Israel sometimes has to go, between the on the edge with the relation on these powers, because we have to play, because Russia is very important in our region, and Russia is in Syria, and we cannot change our attitude to Russia as the Americans want us to do. I think there is more understanding about China. There is more understanding about China nowadays in Israel, about the challenges that it poses to Israel by investments and involvement in infrastructures in Israel and things like that, and the agreements that has been signed about the innovation and etc. And Israel is going to go hand with hand with the United States on this issue. And as I said before, this agreement about technology, innovations, cooperation between Israel and the US, I think part of it is for the purpose to limit the cooperation between Israel and China. It is going to limit the cooperation between Israel and China. So there is more understanding for the Chinese attitude of the US in Israel than to the Russian attitude.
I would divide this into different parts, which is, I think you're right to ask about it. And I agree with Orna that on the Israel part of the visit, Israel is really getting more religion on China, is becoming much more sensitive to the American concerns, setting up its own committee to make sure there's no technology transfers here that are objectionable to the United States. Orna was right to point about this new technology dialogue. There's a strategic dialogue at the level of the NSC advisor. Now there's going to be a technology dialogue dealing with artificial intelligence and a range of other technologies. And that's also a way of the US kind of keeping an eye on the US, on the Israeli-China relationship. So I think on China, Israel's in a much better place where it was a few years ago, where things were not good. There was a huge fight over China's role at the Haifa port and things like that. So Israel has changed its policy, I think, in a way, that American officials tell me, David, it's a better place. Is it perfect? No. But is it moving in the right direction? Definitely. So that part of it, I think, is a piece. Now, I think now we have to zoom out a bit to the Russia-China angle of the entire Biden visit, which is, as an Arab senior official said to me, David, here, look, for us, the Biden visit is not just about the oil. It's about, is America leaving the Middle East? Now, this is something Israelis don't ask themselves, because the U.S. element is a constant. The U.S.-Israel relationship is so incredibly close. But the Arabs are convinced on the official level. And a Pentagon official said to me, we tell the Arabs we have the same troop levels that we've had since the Carter administration. We're not deprioritizing the region. They don't believe us. They just don't believe us. So Biden, I think, beyond the policy specifics, was trying to say, believe us, we are not leaving. You think we'd have to be crazy leave a vacuum for Russia and China. We're not going to do that. And the reason why the Arabs are so fearful is they hear every day an American politician gets up in the US Congress and says, we're energy independent, we're self-sufficient, we don't need the Middle East anymore. The Arabs hear that when it's said in the American domestic setting. So in many ways, Biden's main goal was to persuade them that if you don't believe us that we don't have the same energy needs, believe us that we want to block the Russians and the Chinese, and we're staying. We're definitely staying. Do not underestimate us. So I think Russia and China, it was a huge element in this trip as it provided the backdrop of the rationale for America to say we're maintaining our involvement in the region. Then there's the policy specifics. Of course, Russia, because of the war in Ukraine, and it's and the whole issue of energy independence and energy dependency of the Europeans. The U.S. wants them to pump more, and in the Arab world, it clearly has an impact with the U.S. midterm elections about pumping at the gas pump, wanting the prices to come down. So Russia, in a certain way, was kind of the elephant in the room in terms of wanting to make sure that the U.S. does not, the U.S. wanting to make sure that the Arabs do their part to reduce European dependency. And also there's the element of food security. If you look at Egypt and Jordan, like 80% of their wheat, I think, comes from Ukraine or Russia. Now, what's happening is that the Saudis and the Emiratis are right now subsidizing Egypt and Jordan. But Egypt's got 105 million people. That's a lot of mouths to feed. That's a lot of subsidies. So the issue of food security, and Israel's trying to get in on this with the Negev Summit, set up a committee. That's the thing Lapid did as foreign minister with 5 different Arab countries and Blinken to create now working committees on food security and the like. So in a certain way, Russia is bringing Israel and the Arabs together. But I wouldn't, and this is my last point. I could go on this for hours, but I'll make one last point. I'm sorry to go on. I apologize. But the issue of, and we see this with Putin meeting with the Iranians this week, that they are getting Iranian drones on the Ukrainian battlefield. Russia is becoming dependent on Iranian drones. Not exclusively, they have some of their own, but they need more. And the question is, what price is Iran going to extract from Russia in return? Is it going to try to limit Israel's room of maneuverability over the Syrian airspace, where Russia is a key player, is the player? Israel has had pretty much a free hand. As long as it deconflicts from Russian aircraft, gives them like 60 seconds of notice saying we're coming. But is Russia going to extract something because of a quid pro quo with Iran on drones? So the whole Ukraine dimension is key, I think, to Biden's visit, is to limit Russia's room to maneuver. But now Russia and Iran will probably draw closer. And as senior Israeli security officials said to me, including also a commander on the Golan border who's in charge, said, look, we're worried that Iran and Russia are going to get closer due to this war. And that's something Israel very much has to take into account.
I agree on all the points that you have suggested. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, there's a couple of questions in the chat about Palestinians and that thing. It seems, maybe I'm wrong, and as if the Israeli-Palestinian sort of issue was pushed aside a little bit for this trip. A couple of people asking about it. What do you see as sort of the next sort of phases, if there are phases? Someone's asked if until there's a new leadership at the PLO, is there any point of resuming talks? Do we need new people on both sides, who aren't so dug in? How do you sort of see the next parts of if at all, sort of the Israeli-Palestinian issue? If you want to lead off there.
Okay, what's going on is that the situation both of the leadership in the PLO, in the Palestinian arena and in Israel, both are not ready and cannot do anything about the Palestinian issue. So the situation is like this, that US cannot come with anything that will improve the situation. What is for me, and now it's my personal view, what is the most, concerning issue is the fact that on the ground we are going to the one-state reality on the Palestinian issue, and I think that the one-state reality is no good for Israel, because we cannot be either we cannot be both democratic and Jewish. So the reality is no good. And now what the leadership in Israel came out with nowadays is that great, in quotation, idea of minimizing the conflict. What we are doing now is trying to minimize the conflict and to manage it anyway. And as I see it, it doesn't lead to anything in the region. I think that what is needed is a courageous leaders on both sides, and we don't have them nowadays. And I don't see that they are going to be here in the near future, not in the Palestinian scene and not in the Israeli scene, because of this complex situation, our political complex situation. So there is no good or positive announcement about that, for now at least.
Look, I would say I sometimes use American baseball metaphor, so I apologize to Orna. But look, the U.S. has tried to hit the home run on this issue 3 times. Clinton 2000, Condoleezza Rice's effort in 2007-8. I was part of the Kerry team during the Obama years, 2013 and 14. I think these were noble efforts, but when you swing for the fences, you often strike out. And what's needed is some singles and doubles. You could call it shrinking the conflict. I think it's not just managing it, but trying to reduce its scope and its intensity. If I was a Palestinian, my takeaway from this Biden visit is that the Middle East is moving on. The Middle East has got other issues. In 2002, they could talk about their peace initiative, which is saying it'll take 500 years until the Palestinian thing moves. We're not moving. That was kind of the message of 2002. There's a positive way to say it, but if you move, then we'll move. But now the Arab states saying we have our own interests with Israel. We have our own security concerns. We have our own energy. And the big picture that is not talked about enough is that the Arabs understand that oil is not here forever with all these alternative sources and fracking in America, and that they need to think post-oil, how to diversify their economies, how to digitize their economies. And in their mind, the people who can help them digitize are the Israelis. And therefore, they're not willing to wait for the Palestinians forever. The Palestinian takeaway, I think, should be the Biden visit is a wake-up call. That's a piece I'm thinking of writing. Because the wake-up call should be the Middle East is moving on. And maybe we need a different approach of ourselves. Maybe we shouldn't be so saying normalization, put the cart before the horse. Maybe we should invite Israelis to our high schools and we'll go to their high schools. We should create the kind of civil society peace structures that will actually influence the Israeli elections, because they will see a different side of us. But the Israelis don't see it because of a lot of these rules. Now, the Israelis contribute to it too. I'm not saying they're blameless, and I 1,000% agree with Orna personally that a one-state solution is a disaster for Israel. It'll undermine support in this country, in the United States, for Israel. So, this isn't such a huge blessing for Israel that the Palestinian issue seems to be put on the back burner. But I think now the issue is what can be done incrementally, the singles. I think, ironically, Lapid, who is in an election season, and we'll see how he does in November, but frankly, he's picking up the phone at least to talk to Abbas in a way that his predecessors didn't do for 5 years. There's now a Gantz dialogue, the defense minister meeting with Abbas to increase worker permits, give people a stake more. Now, Israel's up to 20,000 worker permits. Every worker we think supports 7 people there. I think in the 90s, you hit 200,000 people. There's so much more that could be done on the economics. So I think if it's all or nothing in the Mideast, it's always nothing. But the issue is, what are the incremental moves, the gradualist moves? Because we've tried the home run that at least could try to shrink the intensity of this conflict. And the Palestinians also need to see that the Arab world is moving on from them. And it doesn't mean they should give up. It doesn't mean they should think everything is economics. It is not all economics. But when everything is stuck, this is a place to begin. Imagine if Abbas would mend ties with some of these Gulf states that he alienated because he dumped all over the Abraham Accords, and would say, listen, Emirates, come to Ramallah. I'm the private sector. You don't like me? Fine. But let's help the private sector on infrastructure. The Emiratis are fantastic with this. Project management. There's so many things. Let's move things along. The Jordanians want all these train tracks going all over the Middle East. We want to connect to that. That's state building too. There are things in the economic field that have state building implications. But if you're stuck, it's all or nothing in the Mideast, that means nothing. And so this should be a wake-up call.
I think it's not a wake-up call because nothing is changing on the Palestinian arena. All of your suggestions, David, about economic improvement of the situation, they are all suggestions that we were trying them for 20 years. But the Palestinian doesn't think it's not enough to the economic advancement and the project, and they don't want to do anything about it. What is important for them? It's their national aspirations. And if we are not talking about the national aspirations, nothing is going to change, and the terror is going to continue, although we are doing what we are doing, and we are trying to, reduce the flames and etc. Sorry, but I don't see the economic steps that we are taking now changing, causing a real change in this situation. We must have some kind of a political solution, or at least political process. But I know it's
you
a bad
agree,
word,
you agree, Orna, that the leadership
it was used, in the past, and it's but we need some kind of engagement, political relations, and things like that. And the economic improvement is not enough. It's not changing.
I agree. No one has to. I've devoted my life to this issue. I
know.
No one has to convince me about the importance of political engagement. What I'm concerned about is the day after you've started political talks, and the Palestinians said, "Okay, let's go back to where's the final status line." We're not going to go anywhere. And as you point out, the political leadership is not bold enough on either side at this point. And so I think that there has to be engagement. Why don't they have formalized economic talks at least? There you could do so much, but at least begin having Israelis to see Israelis and Palestinians sitting across the table from each other publicly. And that is something I think Lapid can do. Of course, he could do it better if he was elected in November than he can as a caretaker. But we'll have to see how the election plays out over the next few months.
Great. Thank you guys for that. And it wouldn't be a JCRC discussion if everyone agreed, and we wouldn't be Jews if we agreed on everything. So we're right to form.
We agreed about most of the things.
We do agree on most. That's true.
I know. Of course, I know. I'm just joking. It's again, it's not an Israel discussion unless there's some disagreement on something. It's not a real party until that happens. So we're getting sort of close to the end of our time on this webinar. There are a million issues that we could dig in. It's been days on this. So I thank you both for being here, and people with the questions. I think we answered the vast majority of them. So again, thank you all for being here. So as we sort of close down, I just like to just turn it over to our two great speakers here, just for a couple of minutes. Any closing thoughts you have on what should we all be looking out for in terms of U.S. policy or developments in the next few months? What are sort of some of the key things you think we should look out for and that we should have our antenna up for? Orna, we can start with you, and then David, you can bring us home.
Well, I hope that the one issue that David was raising about the fact that Biden came to say we are going to stay here in the region. It's a very important message. I hope that the American policy is going to move toward this direction, that the Americans are here, are in the region, are a factor, they are influencing, they are involving, because, there was a feeling in the region that the Americans are weaker now, they are not interested in what's going on in the region, and I hope that this will continue. From the Israeli point of view, the most important issue is the Iran. And I suppose that it's going to be, there are going to be more discussion between Israelis and the Americans about that on every level. And they will continue to disagree about that. And of course, all the, the follow-ups of what was agreed on the bilateral level, etc.
Look, I would say, on this, I would make 2 points. One is on the regional integration, this was the immersion class for Biden, that he finally saw the Middle East could be a good news story. I think people had been whispering to him in certain areas that the Abraham Accords and all this is kind of a Trump story, Arab states and Israel. And I think here's a president who would love good news wherever he could find it. All presidents want to hear some good news that they can make their own. And I think, he said it's the first time he told the Arabs that I come to the Middle East where there's no Americans in combat, that this is something that I now see possibilities of cooperation that I never saw. So don't underestimate what that means to a president. And ironically, if he loses the midterms, to put this in a Washington context, if he doesn't have an ability to get a domestic agenda across, he'll be a foreign policy president. That's what we've seen. So I think there'll be more Middle East. The fact that he's inviting Mohammed bin Zayed, the new leader of the UAE, who's the linchpin, forward-thinking guy, who's Israel's best friend now in the Arab world, to the White House for the first time of his presidency, that's part of it. So in a weird way, his American domestic weakness might accentuate, deepen his involvement in this region. And that this is not, and in that sense, I think the Abraham Accords does not just become, the preserve of one party and never should have been anyway. But now I think the president is, it's one thing to hear about this in a briefing in an abstract way, but when you live it, as he's lived it for the last week, I think it's much better. So I see that as a big plus side. I agree with Orna on the Iran piece. I don't know if here the Iranians are waiting for the midterms. I think they'd be crazy to, but they might. But if Iran is going forward, this is going to require, and here Orna and I definitely agree, intensified U.S.-Israel consultation on every level on how to proceed in the coming years. So I would not underestimate that. It's just that these things happen behind closed doors and the public doesn't see it. But there'll be enough telltale signs that you will feel it if people feel that there is no deal and Iran is moving ahead. I think it will bring the U.S. and Israeli security people that are close anyway, the military folks. It'll bring them even closer. Just if I could throw in a commercial, I hope that people on this call will join me. I'm having my 4th season shortly. It will begin in a month or so on decision points on the history of the U.S.-Israel relationship and other dimensions of it. And of course, follow me on Twitter at David Makovsky. And it's just always a delight to be with the JCRC. And thank you for inviting me. And I look forward to future discussions and continue all your good work.
I think only half of your tweets are about St. Louis Cardinal baseball, right?
I've lowered it down, but it's sometimes, especially when they're in a slump, like they've been in lately.
But that's the important issues. Go ahead, Orna.
My commercial is behind me. My commercial is behind me.
And follow us on the Washington Institute too. I'm sorry, on our website too, of course.
Yeah.
Right.
Please follow the INSS website. And I want to thank you, Matt. Thank you so much. And
Of
you,
course.
David, of course, it was great to see you again.
Great to see you virtually, Orna. Hope to see you in person. And Matt, thank you for moderating this discussion.
Of course. Thank you thank you both so much for an interesting, informative, and just insightful discussion. There are so many issues to follow, and we can, as I said a couple of times, we could do this for days. We'll make all the links available, I think, on the where the webinar, the recording will be within 24 hours on the JCRC's YouTube channel, and we'll make sure we put links to everyone, to everyone's web pages and Twitter feeds and whatever else you need on the YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us directly. Again, thank you, Orna and David, for your time. We went over time a little bit, so thank you for that. Really appreciate it. And everyone who joined, thank you all for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day, and of course, stay safe and stay healthy. Thanks again, everybody.